All right, we will. Good evening, everybody. It is December 7th, 2022, and the 81st anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. We gathered online a year ago to commemorate the 80th anniversary. The pandemic kind of introduced this way of communicating and gathering online, and given the weather outside and the distance that some of us have to travel to gather, we decided to continue that format another year, having gotten together this morning at the Fort Snelling National Cemetery. It was chilly, some of you were there, I know, but gathering this evening to hear some stories of Minnesotans and to gather and remember, of course, is what we're all about. And really appreciate all of you joining us this evening. Do have a couple of different presenters joining us, and wanted to let you know that we'll pack an hour of your time this evening and have you on your way by 8:15 for sure. But in the interim, we've got some good presenters, storytellers, some things to share with you that you might know, some things you might not know, and appreciate the kind of community that we're creating here in Minnesota to remember Pearl Harbor, now 81 years removed. So we do have some slides. I trust you can see the slide on the screen currently. And just to move us forward, our program this evening, we'll begin with the national anthem here in just a minute, and followed by an invocation, and then have Nick Johnston joining us. And Nick is with the Sons and Daughters of Pearl Harbor Survivors, the Minnesota chapter, or Gold Star, or North Star chapter, excuse me. And he's gonna be sharing his personal story from 1941. And I also believe some insights in what he's doing more recently, currently, to continue gathering stories of Minnesotans from survivors. Also going to hear from Captain Blake Tornga, Professor of Naval Science at the University of Minnesota. Some quick remarks by myself about honoring these veterans moving forward, and some closing remarks by Commissioner Larry HERKE, Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Veterans Affairs. I would ask you again just to mute your microphone during the program. If you've got a question at the end, we're happy to hear from you, of course. But given the importance of the day and what it does represent, even remotely, hearing a live version of our national anthem from Jessica Llewellyn, I think would be a fitting way to begin. Jessica, would you mind?
Yes, I'm going to stand up though, if you don't mind, so I can. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, oh, the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Jessica, thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. You do a wonderful job, even remotely, which is a true, I would argue, artist. Thanks for joining us this evening. We have you on the line, I guess, and you were kind enough to volunteer your talents with us this evening. I don't know, just for a minute, You can tell us a little bit about yourself, or maybe, I know you're the first sergeant with a 210th Engineering and Installation Squadron. Tell us what that group does,
Yeah,
please.
that's a mouthful, right?
Yes.
Well, okay, so I've been a member of the Minnesota Air National Guard, the 133rd Airlift Wing. And for 12 years, I did 11 years in public affairs. And I believe that's how we got connected, with a mutual acquaintance and friend. And then just this past year, I got hired on as the first sergeant for the 210th, which is a geographically separated unit that is with the 133rd. So it's a new career kind of change for me. And for those that aren't familiar with a first sergeant's role, we're really the enlisted voice. We are that liaison between the enlisted and the commander. I work directly with the 210th's commander, helping to advise him with the pulse of the people. We care for them, whether it's in times of challenge or discipline, celebration, all of that. We're kind of their case manager. And the 210th's mission, which I am learning, because again, it's not my career field. I am public affairs, but I am their first sergeant. I would say if you imagine civil engineering and communications, if they were to merge into one, that's your engineering installation squadron, helping lay fiber optic cable. They work a lot with Camp Ripley. So they do a little bit of construction, a little bit of communications, and engineering it all. So it's an amazing group of people, and I'm honored to serve with them, and especially in this new role, it's definitely a privilege.
Well, thank you for explaining that, at least to me, and maybe to others.
Yeah.
I didn't know all of that, so thank you for deepening at least my understanding, and more importantly, thank you for sharing your talents to open our program. Again, moving and important, and I appreciate, again, you sharing your skills and talents with us this evening. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Major Beckwith, an invocation, sir.
My honor. Each year on December 7th, Pearl Harbor survivors, veterans, and visitors from all over the world come together to honor and remember the 2,403 service members and civilians who were killed during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. A further 1,178 people were injured in the attack, which permanently sank 2 U.S. Navy battleships, the USS Arizona and the USS Utah, and destroyed 188 aircraft. If you didn't have the honor or opportunity today, I would ask that you would join me in just a moment of silence, and then I'll continue and pray. Almighty God, as we reflect on the sacrifice of the 2,403 service members and civilians who died during the attack on Pearl Harbor, we are reminded that we must forever be vigilant to the potential threat from others that wish to do us harm. And as our military oaths of office state, from foreign or domestic sources. I pray that in the days ahead, we will forever conduct ourselves in a manner that will not allow us to dishonor ourselves, weaken or detract from our collective mission. As we remain vigilant and posture ourselves to respond to potential real, credible, and actual threats, may we as a country, and especially as a military, along with our international partners, be a source for good in the world in which we live. Protect those that are currently serving, our brothers and sisters in harm's way, those that are currently on mission, and those who are getting ready to go on mission. Give us the maturity and mentally, emotionally, and morally in the days ahead as we lead in our prospective manners and resources, that we would reflect credit and integrity in everything that we say and everything that we do, bringing honor and remembering the men and women who've given the ultimate sacrifice as we do today. I ask that you now bless the rest of this gathering and those that are participating in your holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Major Beckwith. Seems like I hear a lot about Minnesota chaplains. It seems like I know that Chaplain Wynn was just on Minnesota Military Radio Hour a week or 2 or 3 ago. Can you tell us a little bit more just about your work in your department, please, sir?
I'd love to. So funny, Randall. I've been in the military since you and I graduated high school.
Right.
And it was so fun connecting after all those years and looking at you. I'm like, I know you from somewhere. Oh my gosh. What a breath of fresh air to run into a fellow classmate. Been serving since 1988 in various branches, both Army and now Air Force. And I have the privilege to serve during the week as the operations chaplain. So you mentioned Chaplain Wynn. He's my boss during the week. He's not really a boss. He's really a colleague. He is a gentleman that I have a lot of respect for and look up to, and serving alongside him and with him is just a joy. And he gives me opportunities like this, and I will actually be on the next recording for the Christmas show, along with our Air State Chaplain, Chaplain Pulyu, and one of our Army chaplains, Chaplain Coder, and that'll be recorded on the 22nd. So we'll have an opportunity to share that story as well. And the theme this year is many chaplains, one mission. And so we get the opportunity, whether we're priests or pastors or imams or rabbis, to serve all of the 13,000 men and women of the Minnesota National Guard, and to provide for them what their spiritual needs are, whether those are defined as a faith or none at all. And we have the privilege to come alongside our airmen in my role in the weekends as the wing chaplain at the 133rd, but alongside our soldiers during the week and supporting the 50 or so religious support team members that support those 13,000 men and women in the Minnesota National Guard.
Thank you, Major. And I appreciate also for Sergeant Llewellyn sharing a proper introduction to our opening to our program. To move us along, just want to make you aware that this morning, as we mentioned earlier, there was a program at Fort Snelling National Cemetery that you should see on your screen. We met early and brisk, but terribly important, and was a real privilege to have folks on hand, and TAPS and the rifle salute, a fitting way to open the day, and appreciate all the work of the rifle squad. This morning, we'll just note some comments that were offered from the podium at the large United States flag at the cemetery. Today, we honor those who stood firm and fought back at Pearl Harbor, and those who never returned home. We remember these American heroes, many of whom are buried within these hallowed grounds of Fort Snelling National Cemetery. And that's all made possible by the incredible and ongoing work. Many of you are probably quite familiar with the Memorial Rifle Squad at Fort Snelling, but what they do is amazing, and it's been long-term and impressive, and they serve Minnesotans every single day of the year, regardless of the weather. But he does make the point there that many of those heroes are buried at Fort Snelling, and along with that, the realization that we are losing these veterans who were at Pearl Harbor very, very quickly. There are still some in Minnesota. I did reach out to a few of them in hopes that they might be willing to participate. They were very gracious, and at this point just said that they weren't able to. So they are with us, and we do think of them, and they are, to Major Beckwith's point, certainly in our prayers. But where that does take us in some ways is passing the torch on, and hearing, in this case, not from veterans, and this is something that Don Patton and the World War II Roundtable is quite familiar with, but have an opportunity this evening for 15 minutes or so to hear from Nick Johnston and sons and daughters of Pearl Harbor survivors, and want to give him the floor, the microphone, the stage to kind of share, I believe, his own story, having been at in Hawaii, I believe, in 1941, and also share with us his more recent work to try to continue the legacy and story gathering of this generation of soldiers. So with that, I'm going to yield the screen back to my new friend, Nick Johnston, and welcome him to our program. Mr. Johnston. You're muted right now, Nick. Sorry. Hey, Nick, right now you're just muted in the lower left.
My father, Charles Nickel Johnston Sr., was born on a farm. He's a college graduate. He taught school for a while in Mexico Military Academy, Mexico, Missouri. After that, he did 2 tours in the CCCs, Civilian Conservation Corps, in the northwest part of the United States. And he enlisted in the United States Air Corps, Army Air Corps, in March of 1941. Shipped over his family. At that time, his family was his wife, my mother, and my 6-year-old sister. And I was traveling along in womb. I came later out to the world. My father, by December of 1941, he was the commanding officer. He was a first lieutenant then, was a commanding officer of the 481st Ordnance Company of Hickam Field. Hickam Field is right next to Pearl Harbor. And from our home on base, we could look down the road and we could see the channel leading into Pearl Harbor and the ships going in and out. So we were all there during the day. So the day started with my father and us having breakfast. I wasn't at the table yet, but I was 3.5 months old. And my memory is pretty vague about that. I don't remember anything. My sister remembers very little. My sister died 2 years ago. I'm 81, so you can do the math. So Dad was having breakfast and heard the sounds of bombs going off and wasn't sure what it is, but knew that he needed to go and report to duty, which he did. And the ordnance area where the munitions, bombs, anti-aircraft material, weapons, rifles, machine guns, etc., all of that had been damaged in the first attack. So they couldn't get in easily. Nobody, and the person who had the key didn't show up right away. So somebody shot the lock off and they got in and they were able to get a limited amount of munitions out. And at this time, the first wave of the attack, the Japanese airplanes strafed all of our planes that were lined up on the runways and the airways, and they were lined up to prevent sabotage. They were wingtip to wingtip and nose to nose, and they were perfect targets. The Japanese attack at that point damaged several hangars, one of which was my dad's. He was not wounded. The Japanese did bomb one of the barracks, and that's where most of the casualties at Hickam came about. So he came back home about 10 o'clock after the second wave had passed. And he came home and he gave, I have to say that everybody believed at that point that an invasion of Hawaii was imminent, that the attack was there and everybody prepared for that. So when he came home, he gave my mother a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol, 3 boxes of shells, said, go up in the hills and be prepared to shoot all the enemy you can, but save the last 3 shots for your kids and yourself. Unfortunately, she never had to do that. But she was up on the punch bowl, at the very top of the punch bowl, which is a cemetery in an extinct volcano there. Many, if not all, people there are military deceased people. So after a couple of hours watching the attack from a very high vantage point, and not seeing any invasion, she came back to the house. Dad didn't report till later. She was asked by the military at HERKE to escort a Hawaiian lady back to her home. So my mother did that, and while she was there, she prepared a bottle for me. Apparently I was hungry. So she did that, and they went from there to the Iolani Palace, which is where the Red Cross was located, and they were not, Mom and my sister and I were not allowed back on HERKE. So where could we go? So the Red Cross had made arrangements for military dependents and wounded to, well, the wounded went in the hospitals, et cetera, but military dependents to go to the University of Hawaii, Hemingway Hall. And that's where we stayed for about a week and a half. And my mother she was able to go back and get clothing and diapers, fortunately, and bottles. We stayed there until we were allowed back on base. But back home on HERKE, the water and the electricity went off almost immediately in the first wave of the attack. And then there were all kinds of rumors that the water shouldn't be drunk because it's been poisoned. There were rumors that Japanese saboteurs had cut arrows in the cane fields pointing toward Pearl Harbor. However, if you're in an airplane above Pearl Harbor, you don't need any arrows. You have a perfect view of it. But all kinds of rumors were running around, particularly about Japanese saboteurs. So it's not only Pearl Harbor that was bombed. It wasn't just the Navy. It was every airfield on the island of Oahu. And it was a tragedy at all. And so they had planned it very well, the Japanese. And fortunately, our recovery was really pretty good as well. My mother she was at Hemingway Hall. She was photographed by the Honolulu Star Bulletin for a photograph that appeared in the rotogravure section. And she had a handsome young child on her lap and was holding a round disc, which was an identification disc. And it was also picked up by a newsreel. And it was a silent newsreel that she was able to see actually later right after the attack when she got back to the mainland. So the military shipped all military dependents back on 2 transport ships with a destroyer escort back to the mainland. And then they were allowed to resettle. My mother and my sister and I went back to my dad's parents in Missouri, and we stayed there for 6 months until she went back to her hometown with us in Oregon, Roseburg, Oregon, where she spent the rest of the time till Dad was discharged in 1945 in September. He was a proud member of Pearl Harbor survivors for many, many years. And I was a part of it, just a member for many years. And I realized that we didn't have a chapter here in Minnesota. And this last year, I thought we should have one, and I offered to start one. And there were about 30 members. I was given a list of 30 members who were descendants of military. And some of them had died before I was able to contact them. And we've gotten together a couple of times, asked them to work on the stories of their parents. And they are doing that. And I've got some stories to share with you tonight. So one of our members, Carly Ann Pritch from Mankato, wrote an article which is in this December's Senior Perspective magazine. Senior Perspective magazine is a free magazine in really throughout this state. And the title of the article is "Lest We Forget," which is the title, the motto of the Sons and Daughters of Pearl Harbor Survivors. And she wrote that her father, Carl Burhoop, was on the battleship USS Pennsylvania in dry dock. As a member of the ship's band, he gathered on deck with other musicians to play the national anthem for the raising of the flag. Years later, he described the bombing as thus: "At first, we thought they were our planes. They circled around and came in from the east from the rising sun, so we couldn't see them very well. After the bombing ceased, Verhoop helped move bodies from the deck of the ship, picking up a body by the arm and having the arm come away in his hands, leaving the body on the deck." And Kathleen Koch from Forest Lake wrote, she was born in Hawaii as I was, and she spent the first few years of her childhood there. She said, "My father was at Wheeler Field in the Army Air Corps, which preceded the Army Air Force. And my mother was a sixth grade teacher at the military school in the Army base. The three of us were having breakfast when we heard the planes. We were just 3 blocks from the hangar, so we went outside. My mother could see the pilots' faces, the Japanese pilots' faces. They left the civilians alone. The target was the airfield, the planes in the hangars, and the ships in Pearl Harbor. At age 3.5, I remember being outside, my dad holding me. He left immediately to go to the hangar. The Red Cross came in a vehicle, got women and children, and took us up to the mountains. The Red Cross handled it beautifully. We were well taken care of, and I was never afraid, but my mother was terrified. The big fear among adults was that we would be invaded and captured. Koch and her mother were among the people evacuated from Hawaii to San Francisco on the convoy ship, the USS Tasker H. Bliss, which, by the way, was the same ship that I was on. So we had our first cruise together. She was 3 and I was 3.5 months. We don't remember each other. Paulette Peterson from Plymouth said her father, Paul Hansen, wrote about serving on the USS Blue during the attack. The 1,500-ton destroyer was moored alone off Ford Island. Hansen responded to a call to general quarters. His station was a 5-foot gun magazine, which was locked. He left the station to find somebody with a key, and he wrote, "The true meaning of the moment didn't seem to sink in. I gave a Jap pilot a wave because he was so low, but the thought of the war didn't register for the moment. The USS Blue is credited with 4 planes shot down and 1 submarine sunk as we left the harbor." And Richard Gertie joined the Marines at age 17, was on a ship to Hawaii by the time he turned 18 on November 9th, 1941. His daughter, Christine Garrity, wrote that at the time of the bombing, he was at Cap Kalinikon above the harbor. The morning of December 7th, he was sitting on the steps of the military kitchen on KP duty, peeling potatoes. He saw the bombing begin in the harbor, ran back to the barracks to get his rifle. As the plane came up over the hill from the harbor after dropping bombs, he could see the pilots. He shot all 5 of the bullets he had, but was not sure if he hit anyone. After the attack, he was assigned the task of collecting body parts and transporting them to the punch bowl, where a crew tried to identify bodies. Bruce Atwater, who served on the U.S. Coast Guard, has been called up for duty on October 21st, 1941, arriving in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 4th. He wrote, "On December 7th, men were routed out at 6 a.m. for cleaning detail after the previous evening seeing Honolulu until 2 a.m. We began work cleaning the recreation area at 7:30. I was just getting engaged in sweeping the floor of the patio when I looked up and saw a plane with a huge rising sun painted on the side and yellow spurts of fire coming from its wings. I ran out to the front of the building facing the harbor, Battleship Row in plain sight, and watched the disaster unfold. All hell was breaking loose down there," he wrote. USS Oklahoma was capsizing. USS Maryland was sitting at the bottom. And at some point, the USS Arizona blew up. Smoke and flames were coming from the direction of Hickam Field. Small aircraft were running all over the harbor, pulling sailors from the oily and burning waters. I looked up and saw bombs falling from bombers. At 9 a.m., it seemed safe enough to make it back to the receiving station. I was immediately drafted to go back to sick bay, help with the wounded. About 9:30, the receiving station was strafed. At 10 o'clock, the all clear was sounded, but there was no end to the wounded coming in sick bay. The next day was spent cleaning rifles and preparing the land for the land invasion everybody thought was coming. Atwater wrote that orders were given forbidding drinking water, as it was probably poisoned because Japanese saboteurs had been caught near the reservoir. So we drank a lot of free pop for a while. There was no land invasion of Hawaii, but December 7th continues to be what President Roosevelt described as a day that will live in infamy. For the people who experienced the bombing or their family members, there remains an opportunity to share and discuss those memories. So that's what we're asking our members to do. And other organizations in different states have compiled all of the stories into a book, and perhaps we'll be able to do that at some time. My dad went on down to the South Pacific after that, served in many major combat zones and areas. He never talked about it. In fact, the story that I heard about him coming home and giving my mother the pistol came from many other people. And Dad would talk to other veterans, but he wouldn't talk to the family about it. And Mom didn't talk a lot about it either, but she remembers praying with her daughter. I wasn't praying, but they were, and felt comfort in that. And fortunately, my family was all survived as well. And as I said, my dad served in the South Pacific, and he was a Pearl Harbor Survivor member for many, many years. I'm a very proud member of that. And I was in the Army for 2 years. I served as a clinical social worker, serving my time at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. My oldest son, Aaron Garth Johnston, served in the United States Army for 26 years. Went in as an enlisted man. After 26 years, he got out as a major. And he has a lot of proud memories, and he survived all of his conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we're a very, very blessed family. And I'm very fortunate to be alive today to help gather and support those stories coming in, to share with other people like yourselves. Thank you for having me.
Nick, it's a real pleasure, sir. Thank you for your service and impressive service of your entire family, for that matter. If people do want to learn more about the association, how can they reach you or learn more about the work that you're doing here in Minnesota now?
They can reach me by contacting me, calling me on the phone at area code 320-333-5336, 320-333-5336, or my email is n as in Nick, JOHNS 1021 at gmail.com, njohns1021 at gmail.com.
Nick, and just real briefly, your motivation at this point in launching this effort to gather these stories and to hear from sons and daughters, what accounts for that, sir?
Well, we didn't have one here, and I thought we should have one in Minnesota. And when I reached out to people, they were very delighted to be able to join and have a voice and work on getting the stories, not only talking with their parents, but their parents' friends to get the stories as well.
That is a beautiful answer, sir. That's the work that a lot of us do. So I'm happy to meet you through this process and hope that our friendship can continue. And please know the museum will do whatever we can to support your efforts, statewide. So this anniversary, the 81st, will hopefully be the start of something, which would be what really makes these anniversaries at this point meaningful in my mind. Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much.
I would like to add one more thing, and that is I've attended several of the Pearl Harbor Remembrance ceremonies, not the ones at Pearl Harbor, but the ones at HERKE. And they have a ceremony each year. Some of the other airfields do as well. And as a child survivor, I was one of 4 that appeared last year at the 80th anniversary, and I was the youngest of the 4. The other 3 were ladies there. So I've been to the 75th, the 80th. I'll keep going as long as I can and can afford to go. You feel very honored by going there, and so I'm a remembrance of times past.
Well said. To that point, there's no doubt there's endless books written on Pearl Harbor, many of them very, very good. Just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of them. Steve Toomey was our guest speaker on the 80th anniversary in this format a year ago. His book continues to be, I would estimate, one of the very best, counting down to the attack. And he was great with his time and generously shared it with us last year. Local author, Danny Spiewak, actually a KARE 11 news reporter, wrote a book. He was also one of our guests last year, but that would be kind of under the category of recommended reading if you're so inclined, making the connection between the University of Minnesota Gopher football team and the outbreak of the war. Another local author, Dick Klobuchar in the Rochester area, has done a terrific book about the USS Ward. Dick and I met about 5 years ago at this point. All the research materials that he had used in pulling his book together about the USS Ward, firing that first shot of World War II, is now under the care of our museum. Dan Ewert is our archivist, but those files are now at our museum. And also on our YouTube page, we do have 2 videos, one an interview with Richard Thill, and then another 35-minute documentary about the experiences of the USS Ward then, and more recently a reunion that was had years later. All kind of leading into our second presenter for the evening, Captain Blake Tornga, who is the professor of naval science. I'm going to introduce him and invite him to take the slideshow from his end and share his story with us, please.
Well, thanks, Randall. Yep, my name is Blake Tornga. I'm an active duty United States Navy captain. I'm currently the professor of naval science at the University of Minnesota, running the Naval ROTC program. So both the Navy and the Marine Corps midshipmen that will eventually be commissioned as Navy ensigns and Marine Corps second lieutenants. And because I'm active duty, I do kind of have to mention that nothing that I'm saying tonight should be construed to be an official position of the United States Navy. The research that I have on the slides, I think Brandon Montaigne, who I did see in the queue there, is with us tonight. I want to thank him for a lot of the research he did in preparation for this, as we used some of this material in our orientation for incoming freshmen this year. Thought it was important that they have an understanding of the Navy in and around Minnesota prior to the start of their freshman year. So thank you, Brandon, for providing a lot of the information. And hopefully I do your research some justice here in my brief. Just a little bit of background about me. I've been in the Navy since January of 1990. I too was an enlisted member, enlisted initially in 1990, was aviation electronics technician. Spent about 3 years as an enlisted man and got picked up for an ROTC scholarship at the University of Nebraska. I was born in Great Falls, Montana, and I went to high school in North Dakota, had a year of college at the University of North Dakota before I joined the Navy, and then my time in Nebraska. So I get a lot of questions a lot of times about what the heck is a kid from Montana, North Dakota, Midwest, what are you doing in the Navy? And that'll lead me a little bit to my story that I want to tell about the Navy in Minnesota. Because a lot of people say, why the heck is there a naval ROTC unit, even in the heartland at the University of Minnesota? And so I want to introduce you a little bit to the father of the Minnesota Navy, and his name was Guy Eaton. And Mr. Guy Eaton was originally born in Red Oak, Iowa, just east of Omaha, nowhere near anything Navy or naval. He attended the Clevervac College, which is south of Albany, New York, and the closest water there is the Hudson River. Again, not a known naval, Navy kind of setting at all. He came to Duluth and settled in Duluth in 1890. He was doing survey work for the federal government at that time. About 5 years later, he went to Central America and was helping establish some of the railroads in Central America when Spanish-American War broke out. He then returned to Duluth, and President Theodore Roosevelt appointed him the postmaster in Duluth. And there was a quote there, I think from our first Randall, you had asked Nick why he was establishing this group of people. And I think what he said is we didn't have one and we thought we needed one. And so something similar, I think, was where the guy Eaton, who had very little military background, the college that he had been was associated as a military college, but he had no tie at all with the Navy. But he looked left and he looked right and he says, we don't have any Navy here in Minnesota. We probably need something to prepare for eventual outbreak of war and to be able to train people in the naval sciences. So he petitioned and was granted the authority to establish the Minnesota Naval Militia. And he established that in 1903. He and two other members, Seaman Clarence Tuttle and Quartermaster Fred Engels, were the originating members of the Minnesota Naval Militia, or the Minnesota Navy, if you will. And there's a caricature there and a picture of Guy Eaton in uniform. Eventually, the Minnesota Naval Militia expanded into a couple other chapters in Bemidji, Crosby, of course, Duluth, the founding location, and then Pine City. And then there was eventually a small chapter here in Minneapolis also. But something that Guy Eaton needed, and it's something that I, as the professor of naval science, long for, and that's some sort of training models. And so he was a little more successful than I have been in trying to get training aids. He was able to acquire in 1906 a training vessel in Duluth. And that training vessel had been formerly a lighthouse tender for the U.S. Coast Guard for about 20 years prior to it being assigned with the Navy as and renamed the USS Gopher. He was also able to acquire some more funding and included the creation of the Duluth National Guard Armory, which was a joint Army and Naval militia training area in Duluth. Thought it interesting that his training program, and again, I'm kind of envious of the vessel that he had to be able to teach just basic seamanship, navigation, and the naval sciences to young men. And I think it's kind of interesting in this picture that he was able to do that. Again, I'm kind of envious of his toys that he was able to get. Also interesting, I think, in this picture, about that same time period that he was able to get the USS Gopher, and neat in this picture that you can actually read Gopher on the very back of the vessel, but then the amount of activity and the number of people that he has there in the Minnesota Naval Militia that are training at the time this picture was taken. And if you'll notice also in the background, the lift bridge in Duluth that was created in about 1905 in the background. So I think an extremely interesting picture here, the USS Gopher in Duluth. Now, about that time across the United States in about 1940, 1914, excuse me, the naval militias were placed under, instead of the governors running each program, they were placed under a unified U.S. Navy command that was able to assist in some funding also for these units. And about that same time period too, in anticipation of potential U.S. involvement in World War I, the Naval Reserve Force was founded. And eventually, just later that year, late 1950, early 1960, the Navy Reserve was established in Duluth also. So you had kind of similar to what we have in Minneapolis today with the Air National Guard and the Air Reserve. In Duluth, you had the Naval Militia and you had the Navy Reserve Forces. At the same time that we were training on vessels, the Dunwoody Institute accepted the Navy into its academic environment to teach technical training to enlisted members of the Navy. That facility was dubbed the Dunwoody Naval Training School. First started bringing sailors aboard in 1917. When it concluded right after the conclusion of World War I in 1919, they had trained just under 4,300 sailors in technical aspects, many being aviation, but then also on B'nai Makaska, formerly Lake Calhoun. They even provided vessels so that the technicians could learn maritime engine repair and those kind of skills. Just interesting side note to that also, they created a boathouse and they called it Dunwoody Naval Club, where it housed smoking clubs and reading rooms, as well as some of the berthing. And apparently they had bands, the Navy bands would play there on the weekends also. So that all leads us to the U.S. involvement in World War I and back to Guy Eaton. And Guy Eaton, at the outbreak of World War I, just prior to the U.S. involvement, and the Minnesota militia was activated, and Guy Eaton, now as a Navy captain, had to relocate the USS Gopher. And so he sailed it from Lake Superior into Lake Michigan down to the Great Lakes training station, which is still active and is where the U.S. Navy boot camp is located, the same base. So he relocated the Gopher there for training for naval sailors and officers there at Great Lakes training station. And then he and other members of the Minnesota militia then were assigned to other vessels. Guy Eaton was assigned command at various times to the USS Massachusetts and later the USS Iowa. And the picture that I have on the slide then is the USS Iowa in transit. And the Minnesota militia enlisted members served on various vessels throughout the war. So the USS Gopher remained at the Great Lakes training station. And so now the Minnesota militia and the Navy Reserve in Minnesota was without training vessels. And so eventually in 1922, another additional training asset was assigned to both the Minnesota militia and to the Minnesota Reserve, again in Duluth, the USS Paducah. And the Paducah had seen World War I action, had been overseas, and it was a convoy escort prior to being assigned to USS or to Minnesota, to Duluth, as a training ship. And then several years later, she was an old ship at that time. She had seen a lot of duty. But it was perfect vessel and training environment for the folks here in Minnesota. several years later, in 1927, there was an additional vessel that was assigned to Minnesota. This was the USS Essex. Now you can see at the bottom left-hand side there's a picture of the Essex, and you can see that she's pretty aged. In fact, at this time that she was assigned to the Navy Reserve in Minnesota, she was the oldest steamship in the Navy. In fact, she had formerly been commissioned by under Abraham Lincoln. So it was an aged vessel. So the USS Paducah was used similar to the USS Gopher, and it was taken out to sea in Lake Superior, usually 2 weeks at a time, with reservists on board so that they could do gunnery exercises, basic navigation, and watch standing exercises. And if you'll notice in the upper left-hand picture, I want you to take a look at the bow of the vessel there, and you can see it in ice pack there in Duluth. And then at the time, its sister ship, the USS Essex, again is located, and you can see that same bow of the Paducah tied up right behind the USS Essex. And she's in pretty rough shape at this point of her life. In fact, all of the engines and boilers upon removal or upon arrival in Duluth had been stripped down. Her main deck housing was planked over, and she was used as a receiving ship. So it was a cheap way for the Navy at the time to be able to berth sailors instead of having to hire out or have barracks constructed. She was in that capacity for about 1.5 years before she was stricken from the Navy list. She was purchased by the A.J. Klatsky Iron and Metal Works in Duluth for the price of $400. That company stripped all of the metal and usable material off of her, and then within months of purchase, cabled her close to Point Park there in Duluth. They dumped 200 gallons of gasoline and kerosene on board, and they lit a torch, and they burned it down to the hull. And you can still see pieces and parts of the USS Essex in Park Point there. You can see the remnants about 5 feet off of the shore. You can still see the ribs of the ship itself there in the water. Meanwhile, at about the same time period, here in Minneapolis, the Navy established the Naval Reserve Air Base on Wold Chamberlain Field, which had been formerly a race car track, a failed race car track. And you can kind of see from the picture the race car track that kind of goes around the outside. And I'll point out that the hangar in the relief of A here was the naval, the built and assigned first hangar for the Naval Reserve Air Base. The additional hangars here had been Minnesota National Guard hangars and had been abandoned, and the Navy took them over. And we'll talk about that a little bit here in just a second, because the Navy eventually will return the entire Naval Reserve Air Base back to the Minnesota Air National Guard. But that was in 1928. And fast forward, they did reserve air training again out at the NRAB until about 1940. And again, the Navy was anticipating entrance into a pretty good sized conflict. And they reestablished the reserve air base, the Naval Reserve Air Base, and redesignated as a full naval air station. And it was one of 6 V5 programs in various locations around the United States. And it was used for primary flight training. Most predominantly, I think from the flight program at the time, is a name that you'll probably recognize. Ensign George H.W. Bush was a product of this program. He took his first flight in Minneapolis on 21st of November, 1942. So he was just in time for an entire Minnesota winter beginning in November, and saw it all the way through till the same following February. And he logged about 82.5 hours as an ensign in some of the aircraft that you see there on the slide. The Naval Air Station, Minneapolis Naval Air Station, its name was changed in 1946 with the stand-up of a fully assigned unit here, a warfighting unit, VP 911. I don't think there was probably any confusion in 1950 at the use of 911 with regard to for the numbering of the squadron. It sure would not be a designation, I'm sure today. Too much confusion probably when a young watchstander would pick up the telephone and say, hey, you've reached VP 911. But VP 911 was in Minneapolis until about 1950. This slide also just shows some of the aircraft that flew from Minneapolis. Now I want to backtrack just a little bit because I kind of went through the Naval Air Station a little bit, and Randall, you mentioned the USS Ward, so I want to mention some of the things that were happening with the Minnesota Naval Militia and the Minnesota Naval Reserve. In December of 1940, the Reserve and the militia were activated full active duty in the Navy. And they steamed the Paducah, and the replacement ship for the Essex, which was a yard patrol craft number 61. And you can see it in ice there on the bottom of the screen. I don't think anybody had been on board for a long time to chip the ice off. But they steamed both vessels for service to New York City. The Paducah had a major engine change in the 1930s while it was in Duluth, and it saw service in World War II. So the Minnesota Militia and the Reserve steamed the Paducah and the YP to New York, where other crew took over, and then the Minnesota Militia and the reservists were assigned to various vessels, many of which ended up on a ship called the USS Ward. And I know that this group has several times heard the story about the USS Ward, and I'm not going to belabor it, but to say that I am kind of proud, I guess, and in awe a little bit of Guy Eaton and the foundation that he laid for the Minnesota naval officers and sailors, and the training that he provided those folks, because on that same Sunday morning on December 7th, a young lieutenant that had just been assigned 3 days prior to the USS Ward and was now the commanding officer, found themselves outside of Pearl Harbor, basically patrolling back and forth to the entrance of Pearl Harbor. Kind of boring duty on a Sunday morning when nobody was expecting anything to happen. And in fact, the captain was asleep in his stateroom when the watchstanders were notified of a potential snorkeling submarine that was following another vessel into Pearl Harbor. And the USS Antares was on the way in, and they noticed what could be a snorkel in the water. They asked the captain to come to the bridge, and in fact, he was wearing a kimono bathrobe when he went up to the bridge. And I will tell you, for a person that had only been in command for several days on board this vessel, he did not hesitate one time, nor did his entire crew, to see that there was potential threat to another U.S. vessel. They went to general quarters and began firing on what ended up being the Japanese mini sub. Those firing, those first shots that morning at 6:37 were the very first shots of the conflict there in Pearl Harbor. As an aside, 85 members of the USS Ward were from the state of Minnesota, and thus the very opening salvos of the battle in Pearl Harbor were fired from a U.S. vessel, proved to sink the Japanese mini sub as the very first action for the Battle of Pearl Harbor. On the right-hand side, you can see the crew members, many of which were from Minnesota, on gun number 3 from the USS Ward. And I know that many of the people here tonight are familiar with the location of that naval gun at the state capitol grounds in St. Paul. So between World War II and now, NOSC, the Navy Operational Support Command in Duluth, the Reserve Center in Duluth, after World War II, many of the people from that unit again began drilling back in Duluth. However, it was not going to be an enduring base. In fact, it found itself onto the BRAC list in 2005 and was ultimately closed in 2007. As far as the Naval Air Station Twin Cities, it had many aircraft flying from it all the way up until its disestablishment in 1970. And then the Navy returned the loan of the hangars that I previously mentioned back to Minnesota, and the Army and the base there was then recommissioned as the Joint Air Reserve Station, Minneapolis-St. Paul, where we now have the Air Force Reserve, the 934th Airlift Wing, the Minnesota National Guard, the 133rd Airlift Wing, and the Marine Reserve Unit from their Wing Support Squadron 471, and the Navy Operational Support Center, bringing us to the current status within the state of Minnesota, the Navy here in Minnesota. The left-hand side is that Navy Operational Support Command, about 500 reservists that in 21 different supporting units, everywhere from Navy Region Japan that they support to the Commander of Naval Forces Europe. They also have a medical community and a regional reserve intel center within that facility. We also have the Navy Talent Acquisition Group, which is a regional recruiters, about 160 sailors and officers who recruit across 7 different states. And then on the right-hand side is the Navy Reserve Officer Training Corps at the University of Minnesota. Very small unit. We've got about 40 to 50 people, again, both Navy and Marine Corps future officers. And I want to mention just real quickly, over 39 vessels, U.S. Navy vessels, have been named after either the state of Minnesota, cities, places, or people from within the state of Minnesota. And I've highlighted just 2 on there, the USS Minneapolis-St. Paul, which was commissioned just this past summer, and then the USS Minnesota, which is an active duty submarine that was commissioned back in 2013. And I'd like to conclude, I would say also to this group of people and the Minnesota Historic Society and the Museum Foundation. Last time I was out at Camp Ripley with the unit, I saw the mainsails of the former USS Minneapolis-St. Paul that was decommissioned, I believe, in about 2009. I thank you very much for including the Navy in both your hearts, but also your endeavor out there with the museum. I think it's important to capture the sacrifices that Minnesotans have made in the Navy and the Marine Corps also. And I thank you, Randall, for being able to do that, for bringing bringing that sail home. You got a lot of work to do yet before you're able to put that thing out on display. But I thank you all for including Navy in your thoughts. Can open up for a couple questions. I went a little longer than I intended to, but between Brandon, who did a lot of the research for the presentation, might be able to answer anything, or maybe myself also.
Captain Brooks here. Those hangars that were on the racetrack at the original airfield at Old Chamberlain there, are they still around, or are they long gone?
You know, I don't know for certain. The last time I was on the base, there were some Quonset shaped buildings that were there, but I would have to confirm that they're the same buildings. I'd have to take those pictures out and probably confirm either with the current sitting CO of the base. But it's a good question, and I'd love to get to the bottom of to see if they're still there.
Yeah, it would be neat to see them if they're still available. I know when I was at the Reserve Center at 6400 Bloomington Road over there, we took down one of the garages that were out there and stuffed in the panels between the 2x4s with newspapers from November of 1941. So stuff
Wow.
like that may still exist.
Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
I did see just earlier today, as I was kind of doing some more research, that there was a newsletter from the time in the 40s with the Naval Air Station, and there's 5 or 6 of them for sale on the internet. And I just about broke out my checkbook and bought a copy. Somebody here in Minnesota needs to have a copy of those to be able to see what life was like on the base during that time.
I can tell you that the Minnesota Aviation Hall of Fame, we have a few of them in our archives. So if you want to come copy of them, you are more than welcome to do that.
Hey, thanks, Brandon. I'd love to take a peek at them, just to thumb through them a little bit.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We appreciate it. I think that the armory that you spoke of in Duluth is currently undergoing restoration as well. So we'll have a new life here, hopefully in a couple of years. I know they've had a major focus on naval history and the militia up there. And looking forward to seeing what that restored armory facility is going to look like here in a couple of years.
Also, just to add, down in South St. Paul at Fleming Field, a majority of those original hangars from World War II are all still there.
Oh, there you go. There's a good answer. Thanks, sir, Brandon.
All right, we'll move on. And
if I could, just one final comment. The more that I did research about Mr. Guy Eaton, the more I am intrigued about the man. And I hope that the midshipmen and the officers that I am training right now have the kind of discipline and the understanding and the ability that those folks that eventually went out to the USS Ward and did such a fantastic job back on December 7th, that I am in awe, and I hope that I am worthy of the same kind of foundation and training for my midshipmen that he provided to the Minnesota militia.
well said. Again, another example of Blake, you and I working together more in the future. I do hope and trust, much like Nick and his efforts. What we're doing is a lot about the past, but it's also an awful lot about the future. I just want to wrap up with some quick remarks by myself, and then hear from Commissioner HERKE very briefly as well to wrap up our evening. But just to share a couple slides with you that do kind of dovetail into what was just discussed with Captain TORNGA. At the Minnesota Military Museum at Camp Ripley, that I am the director of, we have hosted in the past, and certainly a dated picture, but those Pearl Harbor service members, having shared their stories with us over the years, very close to our hearts, and mine in particular. Richard Thill, had the chance to interview him on several occasions, and some of his items are in our care, in our archives and collections at our museum. As well as, like I mentioned, some of the records from the USS Ward. These are stories we take very, very seriously, and stories that we're going to endeavor to share in a whole new way. Meaning this site, our current facility, has been at Camp Ripley for more than 40 years. We secured 30 acres of land right off of Highway 371. This property in particular, which is adjacent to Camp Ripley and the State Veterans Cemetery in Little Falls, is the future home of a much larger facility. And when we speak together next December for the 82nd anniversary, at that point, our intention is to have a building under construction, which is terribly exciting for myself, and I hope other veterans to know that a year from now, we will have stakes in the ground and a new building will be rising from this field to open in the summer of 2025. To look very much like this rendering looks here. some other versions of that rendering. Is a 40,000 square foot facility on 30 acres developed in close partnership with Camp Ripley and would be a permanent home for this Pearl Harbor story. And it's something we take terribly seriously. That submarine that was mentioned by Captain Tornga, SSN 708, Minneapolis, St. Paul. You're right. We did recover it with the help of the governor's office. Does need an awful lot of work. Brooks Berg, who is on this call and you've now met, is our leader of that project. It will be a multi-year effort, but the intention is to then restore it to its original form and display it on our grounds at this new facility. And most important for all of us is, yes, it'll be great to have these emblematic items of service, but also just as important, more important really, is then gathering the stories of the actual veterans that served aboard that submarine who were from Minnesota, and hearing their stories is what our museum is all about. So we're excited to be able to consolidate much of this information. Remarkable how much the Pearl Harbor survivors did, the actual service members, to gather stories of individuals. We have those records at our museum. The encouragement of Richard Thill and other people to write to fellow service members, veterans, and get their stories. We tracked 480 Minnesotans that were in Pearl Harbor that they reached out to, and have those stories now in our care. So we're excited about that opportunity, and want to wrap up with a few closing remarks from
Randall, Don Pat, could I just say one thing?
Sure.
We actually did 2 programs with the with the USS Ward folks, and we're in the process. They were older. We're in the process of redigitizing, I guess is the correct word.
Yeah.
We'll be sure that those get used. But the World War II Roundtable did a program last year on the 80th anniversary, and I just received this book. Mike Winger and Bob Pressman, who is at the how do I get this on the, there we go. But they have done, this is the 4th of 6 books that they're doing. Each one of them is on a topic. This one is the histories of Wheeler, Bellows, and Haliwa fields. The airfield, like I say, I'm not even sure if it's available at this point. I've got an advanced copy, but the others are on naval, on very pointed. And the thing that's unique about this is they have gone into great detail of getting unpublished pictures, probably survivors, to include in the book. So it's a real unique series, and I encourage people to show some interest in that.
Thank you, Colonel Patton, and I look forward to getting those redigitized accounts from the ward crew members. Thank you very, very much. Commissioner Herkey?
Well, good evening, everyone. I appreciate having the opportunity to talk with you for just a few minutes here at the end of our time together. Just as Randall knows, I am probably the longest supporter of a new museum in the state of Minnesota. I was working on this actually when I was still in uniform. Started back in 2011. So one thing I said to myself before I leave this earth, we will have a new military and now veterans museum where we can tell the stories of our veterans and have a depository of the information and bring their experiences to life. And I think you're going to see that in the new museum. You'll see active duty, reserve, National Guard. You'll see all services equally represented in the new museum. You'll also, I think, get to see a lot of the specific stories, and I've asked the museum to actually work with the counties to make sure that all 87 counties are represented also as part of this museum. So I think it'll be really very interesting. It'll be a living museum, a place for veterans to gather, have reunions and activities, meetings and so forth. And I think it's going to be really something else that all veterans serving for Minnesota can be proud of. Just a moment on World War II vets. I just checked my stats here. We had 16 million service members that provided service during those war years back in the 40s. When I was young, I know World War II vets were everywhere. It seemed like you would find them at church, you would find them just about everywhere you went. As late as year 2000, there was 5.4 million veterans still with us, and I just checked the numbers from the VA, and they indicate 167,284 veterans, World War II veterans still with us today. We know in Minnesota that we have less than 5,000 World War II veterans. It's actually difficult in most of our gatherings to actually find a World War II veteran that can attend because of their age. So if you do come upon a World War II vet, please make sure you pass on your appreciation for their service and thank you for the state and for the nation. It's my understanding that we're losing about 180 World War II veterans every day right now. I did just want to mention that it's important that we take time and recognize service. I'd ask that the museum take a bigger part as it related to these types of celebrations. And I think it is definitely appropriate that we take time tonight, that we share stories. I was intrigued by both Nick's story of his family and also Blake's story of the Minnesota Naval. It seems like I always learn something new, and I just appreciate you sharing both your stories tonight with us. In Minnesota right now, we have about 304,000 veterans, and that number continues to go down. We lose about 5,000 to 6,000 veterans each year, and that's anticipated to continue to get smaller through at least the next 10 to 15 years. So those numbers will continue to get smaller. So it's important that we capture these stories and we preserve them and we share them with others. So again, just thank you for everyone that came together this evening, and I look forward to many more presentations like this going forward. And thank you, Randall, for taking the time to bring everyone together. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner HERKE, for taking time in your evening to gather with us on this important anniversary. Just had a couple of final slides to share with people. And if anybody has a question at the end, you're welcome to ask that as we wrap up. But just a couple of final slides to close out the evening. Our friends are gathering on Saturday, of course, to come together to watch the Army-Navy game. If you're so inclined to join us at the Uptown VFW on Saturday in the afternoon, kickoff's at 2 o'clock. It's kind of a joint partnership between the museum, the Minnesota Navy League. Again, Brandon, thank you for all of your research that was shared today. We appreciate that. And then AUSA as well, of course. So cheer on whichever side you choose to, but if you want to do it together, which is always preferred, please join us.
Beat Army.
I knew we should have muted microphones at that point, but we did not. Nonetheless, please do join us if you're so inclined. It is a free event. It's a first-time event. We're trying to make it an annual gathering. Any chance to come together, I would argue, is something that we should pursue, whether virtually or in person. In person, if again, as I've stated in the past, if you want the finest that Minnesota has to offer in experiences of World War II, the place to go is the World War II Roundtable. Don Patton spoke up earlier. The website for that group is on this slide. They do meet monthly throughout the academic year at the Minnesota History Center in St. Paul. They do have a program coming up next week. So whether on Saturday or next week with Don Patton and the Roundtable and Brooksburg and others, I encourage you to take advantage of that. and any board member of the museum would insist, and I'm happy to do so, that the museum does live and thrive with members. And so what you did see in the way of rendering for a new facility is going to be in neighborhood of a $40 million facility. We can't do it all by ourselves. We need all the help we can get, quite literally, whether that's fundraising, members, people donating stories, artifacts, and the like. But it is the one chance, much like Nick mentioned, or we heard from Mr. Eaton, the state's never done a Minnesota military, a museum for veterans from the ground up. And that's what we're building for the very first time. And we're doing it only because we looked around and there wasn't one. And so our small facility at Camp Ripley, we've outgrown years, decades ago. And now to build a brand new facility, 40,000 acres with formal gallery spaces dedicated to World War II veterans and our other veterans. The time has come, and really excited about the idea of breaking ground the summer of 23 and speaking with you and showing some images of that field being outfitted with a new building when we meet together a year from now. So that's the conclusion of my remarks. I appreciate our presenters this evening and the lovely national anthem and invocation that opened our program. Does anybody have a final comment or two as we wrap up?
Question. Do we know how many Pearl Harbor survivors are left in Minnesota?
Nick, I do not know how many are survivors. I know that we have some information on our World War II vets from the celebration that was done some years ago, but I can't give you the number right now. One of my focus areas is to do exactly that, to get to know both the living and the deceased, exactly who we have left and what periods of service they actually were involved with. And someday I'll be able to answer that, but I can't answer it today for you, Nick.
Larry, Don Patton here. I think Dick Phil, who died about 2 years ago, was the last of the true Pearl Harbor survivors. I'm in close contact with his grandson, who lives in Florida. So,
You know, there's one USS Oklahoma veteran that was on the Oklahoma at Pearl Harbor that we've been in touch with last year and been in touch with just in the last few days, for that matter. So there's a couple still out there, but certainly they are 100 plus at this point. So. Right. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, for marking this anniversary, for coming together. Nick, we look forward to working with you in the future and to the questions that were asked, identifying everybody who's out there, gathering those stories, understanding the current population that does survive in their stories, and working together as a community that we are, is what these kind of gatherings, I would argue, is all about. So when we have Don Patton on the call and others, we can do an awful lot together by working together. So I appreciate everybody's time tonight. God bless, and we'll see you soon.